Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Cohort 21 Iconic Moment with Patti MacDonald and Sarah Craig. These iconic moments are part of the Cohort 21 sort of ongoing series to try and maintain connection and community between each face-to-face as we go, but also to sort of take a step back and take a look at some bigger issues, and sometimes even to take a step in and really get a deep dive into some of the specific issues that we're looking at. Justin?
So we wanted to bring together two individuals who don't need a lot of introduction, but steward both our local accreditation organization, and our national accreditation organization, because these two edu powerhouses have a 10,000, 30,000 foot view that really few of us can acquire, because we're all looking inward. And so getting them together tonight was an opportunity both to ask some questions that we think are particularly relevant, but also hear and now in history in particular, as we got this announcement, but we don't know and can't predict what the future will look like. We'll hear from two wonderful individuals who have some great insight into what the future may hold. So welcome, Sarah Craig and Patti MacDonald.
Yeah, so we work with you both in different ways, but very closely. Our introductions would go on and basically just say how much we love working with you and all those good things. But we want to take a moment to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. So let's start with Patti MacDonald.
Hi, everybody. I'm Patti MacDonald. I'm the Executive Director of CAIS, and it's so great to have a chance to talk to you today. Sarah and I work and I'm pointing to Sarah because she's there on my screen. We work so closely together because interestingly, we both came to these roles from junior school principals of girls' schools. We were colleagues then, and we've continued to partner really closely now. I think that something that we've both experienced in our roles is that people confuse CIS and CAIS and what we do. So at CAIS, we're the national organization, and because education is governed provincially in Canada, we don't really oversee curriculum or teaching and learning or student programs. Those are really the purview of CIS. CAIS, so we are, as Justin said, an accrediting body. So we set national standards and support schools in the process of continual whole school improvement. And we provide professional learning for leaders in schools. We also do some research. So those are our main areas of mandate. I've been in this role now 3.5 years. I think Sarah and I came into our roles at the same time. And it was fun because when Garth and Justin emailed us with some questions in advance, they said, in your new roles, well, new 3.5 years ago now, guys. So
oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah. Like 100 with the pandemic too.
So over to you, Sarah.
Okay, so well, thank you, Patti, because that was really helpful. You set the stage perfectly. As you said, we've been in these roles for 3.5 years. I'm executive director at CIS Ontario, which is the Conference of Independent Schools of Ontario. And as Patti said, we focus really in on the provincial aspects of running independent schools in this province. We represent 45 schools here in the province. And we are only 45 schools out of almost 1,500 schools. So we're quite a rarefied group of schools in Ontario. And we're connected by the national network of CAIS. So as Patti said, we both came from headships of junior schools in girls' schools in Toronto, and have both worked in independent education in a number of different settings in our careers. And but the learning curve over these last 11 months has been incredible. And we're really hoping to share some of that with you tonight. So I guess we'll pass it over back to Justin and Garth for the questions.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. So excited to have you. Okay, so just going to ground some context first, and then we'll jump into the first question. In 2015, Justin and I did a little bit of a research trip as part of a CAIS initiative. We went to Silicon Valley, the West Coast, It's amazing. We looked at all these schools that were quote unquote disrupting education at the time. And the purpose was to see what disruptions or see what innovations are happening that might actually take root. And so as part of, it's called Project 2051. You can look it up. Justin will put the link in the chat. We brought together 44 heads of schools and business leaders from different CAIS schools. And we sort of looked at the data that we had collected. We looked at a whole bunch of other opportunities. We looked at 22 different schools. Did it each, we partnered an academic lead with a business lead, and they did a deep dive into one of the schools that we chose. It's more about the process in the paper, but out of this report came 10 areas of innovation for academics and 10 areas of innovation for the business side of schools. And we're going to address a couple of those head on. So our first question is about that, because one of the big important understandings of our schools is that they are in fact a business, right? We're independent, we're not for profit, but we're a business. And so what impact is COVID-19 going to be having on our business sort of now and in the next 5 years, in the way that the 2008 financial crisis caused a dip in enrollment, and we're seeing some cases where that's the opposite. How might schools use this opportunity to future-proof against the next downturn? So I turn that over to Sarah and Patti. What are you seeing in terms of, if we are in fact a business, how is this COVID-19 going to impact our business now, but also maybe 5 years from now or even more?
Well, maybe I'll start. I think that, this is the $1 million question. And both Sarah and I are members of the CSAE, which is the Canadian Society of Association Executives. And in a session that they ran recently with Peter Hall, who is the chief economist for Export Development Canada, I actually posed this question. He was talking about forecasting, and I said, well, what about independent schools? And interestingly, he has the context of independent schools. He's a Crescent Old Boy. And so he said that although it is really difficult to forecast, clearly the pandemic has been differentially impacting families, who are different economic strata. And those families who are currently full or high pay tuition families have statistically been less impacted by the pandemic than people who need to leave their homes to work generally. And so, he, in reflecting back on the 2008 downturn, he said that, the impact of that was really felt in our schools 2 to 3 years after the downturn, because pulling their kids out of our schools was the last thing that families wanted to do. They didn't want to pull kids away from that educational experience or from their friends. So they held out as long as possible. I think that we're seeing something completely different in terms of this current crisis. I have a little bit of data. We do surveys of our heads of schools, sort of doing a pulse or a check-in on a variety of different things. And just today, we finished the analysis of our most recent survey. And in terms of enrollment data, applications in day schools are trending either slightly higher or significantly higher than they were last year, which is amazing. And I think that, we hypothesize that that's because of the amazingly quick pivot our schools were able to do. A board of education is a really big ship to turn, and our schools are small, they're nimble, and in many cases, they are well prepared for change in this way. Boarding schools are not having quite the same positive experience. I would say that some schools are significantly higher, but generally the trend is more spread out across our schools, and some of our schools are seeing significantly lower numbers. And that would be specifically those schools that are dependent on international students. It's very hard to get a family to sign on the dotted line when they don't even know if they're going to be able to get into the country. And both CIS and CAIS have been doing a lot of advocacy work, both at the provincial and national level, in trying to support our international students. And it's been a heavy lift, and I'm sure Sarah could speak more to that. But I think it's had that difficult impact on particularly our international kids. If there was a lesson to be learned in terms of future proofing against this kind of a downturn, I would say that schools who had already built a culture of innovation in their schools proved to be more resilient than schools who did not. So they've built that muscle. It's part of their culture. In teachers and staff, in students, and in families, they expect the school to be able to turn on a dime and to be nimble and to be responsive to whatever the context happens to be. In schools where they are embedded in more traditional values and where change is not part of their culture, I think it's been a more difficult shift. So if we're projecting out, I would say the very best thing to do, and it's exactly what Garth and Justin were talking about at the beginning, is to ensure that you recognize and the culture in your school is built around the fact that this is a rapidly changing world. You know, the reason why we started you started the 2051 project, I was in that project, I was a participant, was to create that urgency in our schools to understand that they need to be innovating, they need to be thinking differently about the future of education. And the pandemic, I think, is a wake-up call. Like, it's, you know, we were creating urgency before. I think urgency is now knocked at our door. And so to create that culture in your school is going to put you in good stead for future issues. Sorry, that was a bit of a long answer.
No, that was great, Patti. I would agree. And you know, when you think of our schools as businesses, as Garth said, they're nonprofit for the most part. Most of our schools are nonprofit businesses, registered charities, and really rely on revenue in order to run operations. So most of our schools work on a financial model where the annual revenue is the operating budget primarily of the school. And then all of the extra things that happen typically come from fundraising. And so when there's any kind of disruption to the regular revenue stream of the school, you're going to see some panic or some worry about that. So one of the things that happened, which is kind of interesting, that has a ripple effect, is some of our schools, particularly boarding schools, panicked a little bit in the spring and over-enrolled with day students for this coming year. And they are realizing now what a problem that may be for them as time goes on, because they have a bit of a bubble of day students taking up space that used to be reserved for boarding students. And they may or may not have the swing space to really accommodate that. So that's one issue. Other thing about it is that the boarding schools, in particular, as Patti said, for most part, retained their students online this year, even if they're teaching and learning, the learning is remote. It's unclear whether they'll be able to do that for another year. So we're kind of in a wait and see right now as these variants spread around the world, and the situation is very dire in a lot of places, and it's pretty concerning here in Canada, whether or not when those international students leave this summer to go home, are they really going to be able to come back? That's a question. So in terms of enrollments, our enrollments are actually up in Ontario this year overall in our schools. But some of that is extra day students compensating for some boarding student loss. The other area where revenues have been affected is auxiliary programming. So a lot of our schools have summer camps, they have additional rentals, They, might have alumni rentals for weddings, things like that. They might run programs in their facilities during the school year for the community, swim programs or sport programs. So those have been greatly affected, and those revenue streams in many cases have all but dried up unless there's been some virtual programming. So that's another thing where our schools are looking at another summer ahead of really reduced revenues. And so that's something where they're really looking to be innovative, because I think as we come out of this, as Patti said, some of these models that we've been in are getting normed because of the length of time that we're in them. So the longer we're in virtual environments, hybrid environments, flexible environments, the more people are getting used to those and are going to expect those to be a norm when we return to whatever the new normal is. So I think that's another thing that schools need to think about, is to be future proofed, is to be kind of ready to have a variety of models and possible revenue streams for the future.
Yeah, I love that. It actually preempts our next question, but I'm wondering, before we get into that, I'm wondering if you're seeing, like, we're looking at this from the perspective of schools. I'm wondering if we look at this from the perspective of families and the uncertainty, the I don't know, the employment unrest within the public system. Are we seeing any new models come up from students, i.e., I want the independent school education. I don't need to go to school. I don't need to be in the bricks and mortar. Are you noticing anything around a remote only option in schools?
Well, I think that disruption was already here. So that was here pre-pandemic. We were already seeing that it was more bespoke and it was more sort of on the side, but you were seeing students choosing these alternative schools like Blythe, where there's more flexibility. They're independent or private versions of what used to be the specialized schools sometimes that the boards would offer. So I think you were already seeing that, but sure, in my opinion, it's even more attractive now, especially because if students are involved in other things, they're going to be wanting to have maybe the most flexible learning experience possible. And what I think is going to be the next really big disruption in education as well is in the years like 13 to 16, the undergraduate years. So those 4 years of university where the norm has been to go away to school and to live away from home for the most part and to attend school full time. And I'm not sure post-pandemic that model is going to be a norm. So I don't know, Patti, if you want to jump in on that, but I think I see that changing.
Yeah, I think that we've heard over and over in our heads calls that we always essentially start by talking about well-being, but there are stories from every school of the kids who are actually thriving in this environment. And it's different from province to province. We have provinces that do not allow any online teaching and learning at this point in time, that all learning families are mandated to send their children to school face to face. And in other provinces, it's, as in Ontario, it's fully hybrid. And the expectation is that you will be responsive to the requests of families. So the full range is existing, but we have seen a couple of schools start parallel schools that are just online schools. Yeah. So you are registering for the online school, which is a new entity that they have created in response to the pandemic.
Wow. Yeah. No, and on that kind of note, so revenue stream, different kind of vertical, different input. Before we dive into what I think a lot of people are here for, which is some of the teaching learning patterns that you guys have been able to, and stories that you'll be able to tell, maybe we could close off with maybe a few stories on how you're seeing business and ops pivot and change and react, and maybe some of the innovations and creativity that you're seeing in the way that schools are being run, and also maybe how challenges have been addressed some of the stories from the field?
I would say that by and large, what we're seeing is schools trying to be as responsive as they possibly can to their families and support them in whatever way is needed. Sarah was talking a little bit about fundraising and advancement earlier. And when the crisis began, we saw schools starting new campaigns to be able to fundraise, to ensure that they could support families who were hard hit by COVID and keep those kids in school. I think aligned with that, different payment schedules, flexible enrollment schedules, differentiated tuition models. We've seen, I think, all of that across our schools, as well as a move to continuous enrollment. I think that schools are also, while supporting families, they are also looking to retain their current families and looking at different structures and models to be able to do that.
Those are great examples.
Yeah, prioritizing, I would say, relationships. Sarah?
Yes. And I think in terms of one of the business segments of the school, admissions is a big one. And actually, I'm speaking to a reporter tomorrow about admissions in our schools and the pivot that's been made to the virtual admissions experience. So virtual open houses, virtual tours, virtual assessments, really everything that was really sacred as a face-to-face experience has had to become virtual, and really quite unexpectedly in the late fall, right? Even just before Christmas. If you weren't paying attention, you probably didn't know if you were in admissions that you would have to do everything online after Christmas in 2021. So I think that that has been a really big business disruption. But my sense is our schools, that's particular to Ontario, because I think we need to mention that many provinces, especially in the Maritimes, have had almost no disruption to teaching and learning this year. They've had a lot of health and safety precautions, and they're doing screening, and they're wearing PPE, and they're socially distancing and all those things, but they haven't had school closures the way that we've had in Ontario and Quebec have been the hardest hit for that, and Manitoba a little bit as well. So I think that the admissions is one area. And then I think in terms of the financial restructuring, one of the big issues has been whether or not to take federal funding that's been available. And a lot of our schools have wrestled with that because we are nonprofits, yet we are also institutions that serve as a socioeconomic demographic. For the most part, that's a pretty one that is faring better in the pandemic. So that's been another issue, I think, is thinking about even when there's dramatic losses of revenue, where whether or not it makes sense to get government support or not. So lots of big issues for the admission to be wrestling with.
Yeah, and something you said, Sarah, reminded me of something that has been going around, which is it's not so much that we're learning to do these things. It's we can do these things. And a virtual admissions process, it's not the gold standard, it's not the Cadillac experience, but it's possible, right? And it works. And I think we're finding that with some of the innovations in education, in the teaching and learning as well. Which brings us to our next question. What are some of the innovations you've seen across Ontario? And I know that, Sarah, you have some schools outside of province too, right? In CIS Ontario. So, and of course, Patti across the country. What are some of the innovations you've seen in schools? What are they making in terms of the teaching and learning sides of things? Like we're looking at timetables, we're looking at programming itself, any value add offerings, those types of things.
Just wanted to jump back to what you said just before, Garth, because
Sure, yeah.
one of the incredible innovations is really around the recruitment of international students and the capacity to do that student recruitment now virtually. When you think about the amount of money and time and travel in recruitment teams, enrollment teams who have boarding or homestay programs, And, we call them the road warriors. Like, they are all over the world for extended periods of time. And so here's a real innovation when it comes to cost savings, is the capacity to really leverage virtual tours for international families. I think that's been a huge piece. And it's so funny because, people often perceive technology as creating barriers and building relationships. And I think that one of the big takeaways from the operations side of the school is that, in fact, it has made the world smaller, and that relationships are actually in many ways enhanced through the technology. And work from home, I think, is going to continue, particularly on the operations side.
Yeah, I like what Sarah said earlier about the norms. Like, we've never had an urgency to establish new norms. And so here we've got 12 months of practice, and we found, all of the limits we pushed, we've learned a lot of things, and, people are quite now able to go, I think it's as good enough if I get a tour in some really interesting way, meet all the people, because that worked for my schooling. So why can I not learn about a school that way? Yeah, that's really interesting.
And in terms of like, what are the teaching and learning innovations? I think it really is a piggyback on that, Justin, that we, the heroes to me of this pandemic are the teachers, of course, but also the technology teams, because there has been such an incredible fast pivot, but the urgency to make this pivot really wasn't there before, right? Unless you were starting an innovative online school, you didn't really necessarily have that urgency to invest in all of this technology and cameras and all of those things. But now that we've done it, the teaching and learning, the quality of the teaching and learning online, overall, I think is very, very high. And teachers have been putting their heart and soul in our schools, in particular, into finding innovative ways, using all kinds of digital tools and strategies, things that they hadn't done before, and they've learned really quickly. And we're seeing, in contrast, some of the challenges when the technology isn't available, when the support isn't available, when the professional learning isn't nimble, where teachers are struggling because they're out there without any supports. So I think it's a huge shout out to our teachers in our schools that, as hard as it has been, they've really shown what superstars they are in how they've been able to bring an experience that's so different from the class, the face-to-face experience in the class, but they've brought it to new levels, I think, in our schools.
Yeah. So let's use that to jump back into the next question, which is, what innovations are we seeing in teaching and learning around timetables? And in particular, this is from one of our attendees, Penny. Thanks for the question, Penny. It's a more nuanced question, but she asks, I believe many of the independent schools have traditionally offered a full year program at the secondary level as opposed to a semester program. We have seen, and we've got semesters, trimesters, quadmesters, quintmesters. I don't know what an 8-mester is, but those are out there too. So she says, and I think we all would be interested to know, how many schools have changed their instructional approach, and which approach seems to be is there an approach that seems to be working better than others? And do you think any of these are sustainable? Do you think there's an appetite to keep this type of approach even after school closures are over?
I think there's lots of learning happening, and we know that people made the decision to go to quadmesters, 8-mesters, whatever we call them, in order to protect their students and provide continuity of learning. So if they had to jump online, offline, online, offline, that it was more discrete packages, I think, is what people were trying to create. But I think that in doing that, learning is happening, and people are seeing the benefits of some of these programs. I've heard heads who had full year programs now looking to have sort of a dual track, where some things are semestered and some things aren't. I think some schools had great success with the quadmesters, and it gave some flexibility too, with some additional enriched programming. So, I think that each school has its own unique value proposition. And I think each school is asking itself this question, how, now that we've seen that we can have flexibility with our timetable, how do we find the approach that really enhances student learning in our context?
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think we're seeing that, and the same is true with holidays, right? We're seeing that with holidays and things as well. So Sarah, over to you.
And I think too that it's not. I mean, the scheduling is important, and we've seen great success with all of these different models. But the thing that has always been our challenge in education as an entire sector, but certainly in our schools too, is around the assessment of learning, right? So it's assessment that really has to change when you're fully online. You cannot rely on traditional assessment models when you're in a fully online or flex or hybrid high flex model. And so I think that if there's something positive about all of this, it's really driving that assessment change and change of evaluation approaches, getting away from some of these really heavily weighted large exams and things that we know are very traditional, but yet the research doesn't bear out that they're great markers or ways to collect evidence of learning. So it's a really good, I think, time for us. It's forcing us to rethink. And I think all of these different models, whether it's quadmester or octomester or trimester or whatever, they're really, as Patti said, they're really ways to spiral the learning, right? It's about how can we get through learning and keep revisiting and not get stuck on one thing, so that if we get or on this long journey where we're carrying 8 courses at a time, so that where we get stuck, we can't pick up the learning again easily. So I don't think it really is about any one model being better than the other. It's more about the spiraling of learning and how are we going to know what they've learned and be able to document that well.
Yeah, so I love that idea, that we really have to dive into assessment. I love what Patti was saying around, let's take a step back. Let's almost treat this as an experiment, and let's reach out into our networks and ask what was good, what was difficult. I know that our school is looking at a hybrid of some courses in semester, some courses run all year because of the nature of the course. But we have a question from Tim Rollwagon from Lakefield College. Thank you, Tim. He said, I would love to know how the network of schools is shifting this and to prioritize specifically around soft or hard skills that he says actually matter in life. And my research is really in the World Economic Forum, the OECD, DQ Institute. And I know there's a few of us in Cohort 21 that are really diving deep into these larger sort of bodies of research about these these huge skills, these big skills that will serve both now and then in the future, transdisciplinary skills and transactional skills. So are you seeing any prioritizing of these skills over, like academic rigor?
Content coverage.
One thing I'll just jump in on, and then I'll pass it over to Patti, is, one thing that happened last spring was some of our schools were caught when they didn't have traditional exams, or in particular, some of our IB, International Baccalaureate schools that end in May and then typically have exams. They had nothing for students to do. And so many schools put together some really interesting programs where they were literally teaching life skills and offering mentoring from the community and teaching kids, how to do laundry and make dinner and some of those life skills, in addition to all the great sort of transdisciplinary type of skills that you're talking about, Garth, those executive function and things like that, where we're always trying to embed those in the learning. But I think that as we look ahead to this spring, schools are also thinking about enhancing those types of programs and figuring out ways, if exams aren't going to happen in traditional ways, what can they do to give students other types of learning opportunities, other real world experiences in a virtual way. So I'll let Patti jump in on that.
And I was going to say, I think Lakefield's a good example of that because of the module program that's being elevated as a response of really keeping kids engaged and And so I think that we're seeing these kinds of programs popping up across the country. I think is a great question. One of the questions on our most recent head survey is when it comes to a variety of different categories, how do you anticipate spending next year's budget compared to this year's budget? So how are you prioritizing resources, and the place where there will be, most people said there would be a greater investment is around social emotional learning and non-cognitive skills or soft skills or transdisciplinary skills, whatever learning skills, I guess, is a good way of calling them. So we do see that this is a trend in our schools, that there will be further investment in enhancing this programming.
And wellness and mental health, not only for
Yeah.
students, but for employees as well. I think all heads are that we're seeing are talking about that, on repeat. They're really concerned about everyone's well-being. And I think that will continue to be a priority for investment of time, resources, and attention.
So we've been, and I agree, Sarah. I think one of the big pieces is like well-being is the learning at this point, right? I've got two young boys at home, and it is a very real thing to see them almost hour by hour. So I appreciate that. And we have another question from the audience. I think it's a really good one. We're grounding much of our conversation here in the older grades. I'm wondering about PK, JK, SK. Will independent schools continue to offer a blend of synchronous and asynchronous learning? Like, the question is, have you noticed any schools cutting in this area? For example, if there is a hybrid approach or online approach, just starting it at a certain grade, like grade 1 or grade 3, something along those lines.
I think it's really hard to predict. We're still sort of in the heart of the crisis right now, and schools are just working really, really hard to meet the needs of their learners and provide continuity of learning in the very best way possible, in depending on the context. Certainly, I don't think we've seen any elementary schools moving to a hybrid approach where they have not been mandated to do so. That I think face-to-face contact is valued by everybody. But I also think that we've heard feedback that elementary school teachers are learning about the richness of resources available from a digital perspective, and the capacity for flexibility. When a student is sick or is off for an extended period of time, and ways of integrating kids into classes in given different obstacles. So I think it's still a learning time, but as I said, I haven't heard of anybody who is choosing to be hybrid if it's not a requirement.
Mm-hmm. And I think as the pandemic has gone on too, here in Ontario anyway, early on the government was looking more at the different divisions and possibly having different approaches for different age groups when it came to being in school or not. And that seems to have subsided quite a bit in favor of sort of more like either all the schools are open or all the schools are closed. And I think it's just because it's a different type of challenging, but the types of worries that we're seeing amongst educators and the types of challenges that you face when you're face to face, if it's we're in a state of emergency versus regular times are the same. So I agree, though, that I think the early years will continue to be face to face. I don't think we're going to move to a time where kids are going to go to digital kindergarten. But I think right now schools are not going to want to sacrifice those programs, because that's often the entry point for admissions to our schools. That's where many of the families that become sort of a through line throughout the school are established with the school. And so those programs are going to continue to be relevant.
So we have seen, certainly in my experience with Cohort 21 and at my school, we know that teaching in those grade levels is arguably the most difficult. It's it's really hard to do because there's expectations from parents. There's certain skills that they need, that students need to navigate on and offline and those types of things. I'm wondering, we'll start there, but I'm wondering, and we can stretch it out to the JK to all the way to 12, but what are independent schools doing well to either attract, because every school's hiring, that's what we learned, right? Um, what are independent schools doing really well to attract and retain faculty?
I maybe can start just at the association level. I can tell you what we're doing to support our schools is we typically have done recruitment at the faculties of education in person, and we're doing all of that remotely this year. And we actually have more volunteers from our schools helping with those recruitment fairs than ever before. And I know that's driven by need because schools are filling more positions than perhaps they've had available in the past. And that's because they're adding additional teachers, and also because perhaps they're seeing, some level of retirements, or other reasons why they have more vacancies. So those fairs are, I think, opportunities for us to get the message out to the faculties of ed, to a broader base of teachers, new teachers coming into the profession who might not know about independent schools and might not know about the benefits of working in our schools. And we're trying to do that as well as do a lot of promotion on social media. And I would say that our schools are doing that as well. I just saw online today that one of our schools is actually having a virtual open house for teachers to find out about teaching at their school. So, and that's Appleby College is that's coming with them. So those are the types of innovations. It's really about tapping into a market of teachers who maybe traditionally haven't known about working in our schools and can be attracted to put in an application.
Yeah, I can certainly, attest to the fact that an onboarded teacher in your school right now is a very valuable asset. Someone who knows your system, has a sense of the expectations, is literate in your platforms, has got collegial, friends and all those things and so, yeah, this conversation around retention, I think, is really, really important. There's a market, and teachers are very valuable right now. So keeping them well and also feeling supported is job one of schools right now. And then I know, or I can anticipate, an uncertainty. We've all already submitted our budgets, and they were under the most extreme conditions. So we've priced in a kind of, I think, pretty heavy roster, or at least potentially plan for one. I can only speak for our school. We thought, well, it's probably going to be like next year, so let's prepare for that. So our talent inside and keeping everyone kind of around is going to be a big part of this. But I also know that, you want to get teachers to come to your school who there will always be vacancies, mat leaves and other kind of just life changes. So that example you shared about Appleby is a really interesting one. I didn't know that.
I think that in the spring, we left the last school year with a real concern about student well-being, and that we felt that coming back in the fall, that was going to be our number one priority, both from a safety perspective, but also from a mental health perspective. And I think that what we saw cut through the fall was there was a huge impact actually on the adults in the building, a greater impact than we anticipated. It was, everybody worked so incredibly hard over the summer. Teachers were upskilling, leaders were trying to create the perfect protocols so that COVID would never come into their building. Children would never get sick, adults would never get sick. And we learned that was an unrealistic expectation. And, the first time all of those structures failed, leaders felt they'd failed, teachers felt they'd failed. And so there was a huge, and continues to be a huge burden that is being carried, I think, by the adults in our buildings that we really need to be thinking about. And as Sarah said, it is a topic of every head's call. One head actually one day said, you know, I wake up every morning and I feel like I've got a boulder on my chest. And that is a reality in these incredibly quickly shifting times with different directives from the government, different expectations from families, different expectations from faculty and staff. It's a really hard time to be an adult in a school right now. And you know, some of the things that we've heard from heads is, you know, that they see it, they experience it, and they're prioritizing it in their daily work. You know, things like, you know, this, and this is one that we laugh about all the time, but pies at Thanksgiving, you know, like a simple gesture of a pie at Thanksgiving makes you feel appreciated. And those moments of gratitude, of showing your gratitude, are so important. You know, so from sort of a simple thing like that to a simple, you know, email, a check-in, a card, you know, so finding ways to, again, prioritize relationships, be there for each other, recognize the reality of the life experience of teachers right now. You know, so many people are, as you said, Garth, at home with kids, teaching at the same time as you're trying to be a parent. And it's important that school leaders recognize that reality and have expectations that are commensurate with the life experience that people are having right now.
I also think that people, that one of the things that's been interesting about this pivot in teaching and learning is that, you know, some of the younger teachers have been really, really successful. And some of that is, one, they're digital natives to begin with. And two, I think they don't have a lot of barriers to the change, because it's new for them. They're new to the profession. And so many of them have been very successful. And I think too, people at later stages of career have also some of the pressures that Patty's talking about: family, young children, and in particular, I've noticed, you know, certain disciplines have struggled much more than others. So, for instance, in general, I've seen math teachers make a pretty easy pivot because a lot of them were already using a lot of digital tools and technology and virtual whiteboards in the classroom and things like that. Whereas, you know, something like the performing arts, music and drama, it's been more challenging. And I think what it's really required is giving over some of the agency to the students, to have the students figure out the ways that they can share the demonstrate learning and take charge of the technology, especially if the educator doesn't have that skill set. So I think it's an interesting time in looking at how different sort of age groups or different groups of with years in the profession have adjusted, and different disciplines, because I don't think it's been universal for everyone. And to Patty's point, the mental health thing is again huge, still huge problem.
Yeah, just to comment really quickly on something that Patty was saying. There's when we talked about the very first question, our schools are businesses, right? But there's a great article, I think it was like, honestly, 6 or 7 years ago, and Justin knows I reference this article all the time, but the title of the article is something akin to "Schools don't change like businesses, they change like villages," right? Because we're talking about all these things. I wonder how many, like, quote unquote business corporations would talk about sending pies, or talk about, you know, focusing on these relationships, because they got different pressures or they've got a different lived experience. Whereas in schools, it is so human, it's so relational, that this is something that's really sort of pressing. It's we need to prioritize it. Our school was all kids on campus every day, and I remember this great conversation with one of our teachers, and I said, how's it going, you know, good to be back on campus? And he said, yeah, it's just still really lonely, because the way we had it set up was cohorts, you know, and you lost that interconnection. So I appreciate both of your comments. Listen, we don't have a lot of time, but we have some great questions in the chat. So Justin, I don't know if you're okay with this, but I thought we'd borrow from Celeste's exit, where we just do like fire some questions at you. So we have 4 questions. So just give us your best response, because I don't want these questions to go unanswered, but we'll keep them brief. So we'll start with the first one, because I think it sort of builds off what we're talking about. So Tina asks, regarding compassionate thinking, do you have any examples of schools doing a good job during the pandemic around continuing with service learning, community outreach, or anything along those lines?
Sarah, you've got some good examples in Ontario.
Yeah. Why don't you jump in and say, because nothing's coming to mind, not that there aren't a lot of examples, but you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about things like right from the very beginning, schools creating PPE, right? They're using their laser printers, they're creating PPE.
Yes.
They shifted their food services. They started providing food for first responders because they were trying to keep their food services people employed, but there were no kids on campus. So I think that people have tried to be responsive to current needs with the resources that they have.
Yes. No, that's very true. Lots of examples of that. And I think also just finding virtual ways to connect. So I think in a lot of the schools, I mean, the ministry maintained the service learning requirements for the graduation diploma. So they've sort of encouraged students to find virtual ways to give back. So we have seen, a lot of examples of that, and also things like giving back by doing food drives and collecting food, some of the things that we've always done, but figuring out how to do them in the COVID context, I think.
Awesome.
One of the things that people say they're going to keep is all of the recordings they've been doing of things like Remember and Stay, like creating something that they can be streaming. And so I know that schools are streaming that to alum, to families, etc. But I think that they're also, as Sarah said, streaming to outside of their communities, to long-term care homes, etc. So ensuring that there's a broader audience.
Awesome. Tim asks, how might we leverage the network in this remote or digital world to connect learners across the country? Are you seeing any examples of that happening?
Yes, well, CAIS, as a matter of fact, as we have our middle school leadership camp coming up, virtual camp.
Perfect.
There you go, Tim. There you go, Tim.
So you just connect with me and I'll hook you up.
Awesome.
That's great.
And Ruth asks, are there examples of schools connecting with local colleges or universities as a way of breaking down, these quote unquote physical walls we had before, to try and actually extend into in the other direction, extend outward to get different credits from different organizations? Have you seen any of that?
I haven't seen any of that yet, but I think it's coming. So as I said earlier in this broadcast, I think that those first 4 years post graduation from grade 12, I think are going to change quite a bit. And I think that those kinds of partnerships, I'm not sure that as many students are going to go to undergraduate full time when they leave high school. And so we're going to see different types of kind of co-op type programs. I think kids are going to be eager to get into the workforce in some way. So I anticipate we'll see more partnerships with colleges and universities in the years ahead, but nothing official that I've seen yet.
A kind of a addition to that, we explored and contacted OISE and had a series of teacher candidates that we onboarded and gave them an opportunity, and that actually ended up being awesome for small group breakout, like just creating different ratios. So that was an example of kind of bringing the outside in to support the academic program and offer just more expertise.
Well, the Ontario government has formalized that with the Ontario College of Teachers. So candidate teachers right now can get an emergency credential to actually work in public education right now, and have always had programs potentially in our schools as student teachers or maybe as special interns. But I think we're going to see more of that.
when it comes to students, I know that some of the work that I'm involved in too, with some other schools and some people on this as a participant in the attendee in the call, is this idea of micro credentials, this idea of working with third parties to undergo an experience, demonstrate learning, and then being able to actually get a micro credential that, if they so have it, can put it on their LinkedIn account. Patti, did you want to jump in on this too?
We actually, CAIS has got a webinar upcoming on micro-credentials. So that will happen, I think, probably post NLC. So the National Leaders Conference is coming up in April. And actually, Peter Hall, who I spoke about, the economist, will be one of the keynotes there. But yeah, no, we have an upcoming webinar.
I just keep setting them up. You keep knocking them down. This is amazing. Okay. Last question, then we're going to wrap. Is there concern about the exodus of families from large cities? We've seen that, right? On the reduction of the student body or desire to have an online independent school. So we talked a little bit about that, but this question is there a concern of the loss of teachers who desire to leave the city due to the same reason? I know I've had a couple of teachers move out of the city, and also because young teachers, cost of living and things like that. So how are these going to impact teacher retention of younger teachers who've adapted so well to online teaching?
I mean, I think we had already seen.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think we'd seen some of this already, and I think from an association perspective, it's a potentially a good thing, because some of our schools in smaller cities and smaller rural areas have had a more difficult time sometimes attracting teachers to live and work there, and so we had already seen, I think, before the pandemic, some great cross-pollination of people, finding the city too expensive and moving out to some of those schools. And so we've seen a lot of healthy movement amongst our schools. I think one of the challenges will be retaining teachers to the independent schools when there's going to be a lot of openings available in the public school system. So I think that might be one of the challenges. So as long as our schools are offering great competitive salaries, which they do, and benefits, and great support and teaching programs, I don't see that we're going to have a real sort of brain drain amongst our teachers. But I also think it's important for schools to hire and mentor young teachers coming right into the profession. If your staff is too top heavy with more experienced people, you won't have that pipeline coming in.
Great. All right, it's 8 o'clock. We're going to end it on time. Patti, Sarah, this has been absolute gold. Love your perspectives. Love the examples too. And also to know that there's some great things that are coming up as well. So with that, we will say thank you to everybody. Any last words, Justin?
No, just thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thanks everyone who showed up. And we'll post this to our Cohort 21 channel, and people can benefit from all this great insight. You guys are amazing.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see many of you on Saturday, which is our third face-to-face. Patti and Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Stay well, be well. See you soon.
Thank
you.